So thank you for starting the recording, Eric. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third meeting of the Rules Advisory Committee for the Drinking Water Source Protection Program at OWEB. We'll start with our standard round of introductions, then we'll take a quick peek at the agenda. And we'll dive right in. So I'll go ahead and kick it off in terms of introductions. Renee Davis, Acquisitions and Special Programs Manager at OWEB, and then I'll go ahead and just call on RAC members to keep us moving. So let's go first to Steve.
Good morning, everybody. This is Steve Graper, Rhododendron Water Association President.
Thanks, Steve. Stephanie?
Hi, good morning. Stephanie Reed with Lincoln City Water District.
Good morning, Stephanie. Daniel.
Daniel Weir with Sustainable Northwest.
Thanks, Daniel. Dan Brown?
Good morning, everybody. Dan Brown with the Environmental Protection Agency.
Thanks, Dan. Gabby?
Hi, Gabby Fajeda, and I'm hydrogeologist with the Oregon Water Resources Department Groundwater Section.
Thanks, Gabby. Julie?
Good morning, Julie Harvey, the Drinking Water Protection Coordinator at Oregon DEQ.
Morning, Julie. Kristen?
Hi, everyone. Kristen Larson, Water Funding Coordinator in the Infrastructure Programs in Business Oregon.
Thanks, Kristen. And just for everyone's benefit, so John Unger has done the official handoff to Kristen, so she will be representing Business Oregon on the RAC, and we're thrilled to have her here. Anne?
Anne Velisis, I'm the president of the Port Orford City Council.
Thanks, Anne. And Michelle?
Water Project Manager for the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. So it looks like we have a couple observers, CoinDesk and Kim from Depot Bay. We do have a phone number on, and I want to make sure it isn't a RAC member. So does the phone number ending in 3046 happen to be Lori Bell? Okay, so probably another observer. All right, so we have a few other folks joining, which is great. We will have public comment at, I believe it begins at 11:30. So as we get closer to that time, we'll ask folks to raise hands if you're interested in providing public comment. Otherwise, glad to have you on as observers. Robin, do you want to go ahead and share the slide with the agenda? Super, thanks for that. Okay, so welcome and introductions. We're through that portion. So in terms of the agenda for today, not unlike last time when we had the Bond Funding 101 with the representatives from DAS, Department of Administrative Services, we're going to spend some time this morning asking Robin to walk us through the protective instruments, kind of 101 primer, if you will. This is to make sure that we're all starting from a common space in terms of understanding some of the instruments that might be used to protect source water areas. And from there, we will dive into review of the draft rule language. We'll have a couple chunks of time for that, taking breaks here and there. We have the public comment period slated for 11:35, and then we'll do some wrap ups talking through next steps. So one quick piece that I'll mention now so that no one is concerned or anxious as we're spending, half an hour plus on protective instruments. And I did fail to have OWEB staff introduce themselves, so we'll jump back and do that in a moment. We are not expecting to get through the entirety of the draft rule set today. So if we are spending a little bit of time up front on some of the rule content, that is okay. This is our third of 5 meetings, so we want to make sure that we spend time as needed walking through those substantive issues. So My hope is that we'll make, good progress, maybe halfway through. I'll move us along as needed, but just in terms of timing, just expect that we'll be moving not slowly, but methodically through the rule review. Robin, will you unshare for a moment? Apologies to OWEB staff. I forgot to have everyone introduce themselves. I'm so excited to get to protective instruments presentation. So we'll start with Robin.
Hi everyone, Robin Meacher. I'm the Conservation Easement Specialist in the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program at OWEB, but I've been working to help support the rule-making effort for drinking water source protection.
Thanks, Robin. Eric Hartstein.
Good morning, everyone. Eric Hartstein, Senior Policy Coordinator at OWEB. Good to see you.
And Audrey.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Audrey Squires. I'm the new Drinking Water Source Protection Specialist.
Thanks, Audrey. And Rachel Thompson is at a training this week, so she's not able to join us, but we'll update her after the conversation today. So I think with that, we're ready to jump into the Protective Instruments PowerPoint.
Okay, are you seeing my screen with the slide advanced?
We're seeing use of grant funds.
Great. Okay, so I'll dive right in, but giving folks a little bit of context on this in this draft rules that we provided and sent out to y'all. You'll have noticed similar terminology for how we're referring to the types of instruments that can be purchased using the grant funds here. And so we just wanted to spend a little bit of time going over the high level concepts of what each of those are, recognizing that there's technicalities and all sorts of other things that can get us deep into the weeds. But as Renee said, we wanted to kind of give the high level terminology background so that when we're discussing this, everybody's kind of coming at it from that same area. So I'll go through this, but did want to ground folks in kind of where we started with this. It's based on the legislation and then the statute for the program, which essentially says that the grants awarded for these funds should be used to acquire lands from willing sellers, enter into covenants, easements, or similar agreements, and those are all for the purpose of protecting, restoring, or enhancing lands, or for repaying a loan used to finance or to protect, restore, or enhance land. So we're going to focus on this highlighted language, which is where we drew these instruments from. So starting off, and I can't see any of you, so Renee and other OWEB folks, if there's something that needs to be halted or questions can come at any time, but we might want to save those for the end too. So we're going to start kind of at the highest level, which is the acquiring lands. And when we see this, we look at that as the fee simple title ownership. So this is the type of ownership where you have one group or an entity or a person, but basically owns the land by themselves. There's no other person, group, or entity that has an ownership right currently or has a right that will pass to them at some point. So it is kind of the most holistic type of ownership and acquisition that we are talking about in this. And so I'm going to go kind of into the kind of when you think about property rights, the favorite analogy here, which is property rights are a bundle of sticks. And so each stick represents that distinct ownership right. And then fee simple, the most simple way to think about it is that it is all of those sticks being held by the same entity. And so these types of ownership rights or sticks are can be all sorts of. This is a fun little graphic for it. I'm sorry it didn't transfer over very well. It's a little fuzzy, but really we think about it as possession of the land, which is the legal right to physically possess and control the property, and that is also to exclude others. And then enjoyment, use and enjoy the property in any legal manner, and disposition, which is sell, transfer, rent, lease, or mortgage. So it's really all of those types of uses of the property that really come all together to be fee simple. And then in the language of the statute and the enabling bill, we have entering into covenants. So covenants are essentially promises, contractual promises made in a formal agreement between two parties, which gives one party certain promises and assurances. So it's a real kind of high level concept, and just that through a covenant, you're promising to do something or to not do something with the land. But when we talk about covenants and the concept of real estate, we're talking about real covenants that are attached to the use of the parcel of the real estate, as opposed to kind of following a person. There are some elements that need to happen to create a covenant under Oregon law. And when I say Oregon law, most of this is referring to nothing that's written in statute, but just how things have been interpreted over time, so common law. And those covenant elements are outlined here. They need to be in writing. They have to have been intended to be promises. And then the covenant, again, has to touch and concern the use, occupation, or enjoyment of the land. And there must be privity of estate between the promisor and his or her successor. So these are just essentially, I don't want to go too deep into like the elements to create one, but they're just essentially explaining the differences between what a covenant is. And then we'll talk about some similar agreements, that there are these technical elements that differentiate between one instrument and another. With covenants, they can be limited in duration, and that is typically limited by the terms. That can be a term of years. They can be limited by a specific occurrence or event that may trigger termination. And then along with kind of every instrument that's not a fee simple one, there's certain things like merger that can, which is when the same entity owns the fee simple and the instrument, and so then the essentially title merges in that, and so the encumbering instrument is essentially terminated, and then release or rescission or an agreement by all the landowners. And then we'll touch a little bit on equitable servitudes, which are very similar to covenants, except that basically they are kind of a technical distinction, but it will be enforced without that privity of estate as long as there's a reasonable relation to the land involved. So it doesn't have to necessarily be enforced. It can be enforced at equity, which just means that again, it's kind of a technical distinction, but they function very similarly.
Hey, Robin.
Yes.
Just a note to the RAC members, after Robin goes through her presentation and we answer any questions that you might have, or at least flag questions, if we're not able to answer them right away, we have asked Steve Graper to share a brief description of Rhododendron Water Association's experience with an equitable servitude. We thought it would just be helpful to have more of a practical on the ground example from one of your fellow RAC members. So know that that's coming towards the end of this. Thanks, Robin.
And then also referred to in the statute is easements. And I'm going to focus on kind of the higher level, just basics of easements, and then we'll go into discussion of conservation easements, which are a special type of easement after this, and then we'll talk a little bit more about other agreements. But so essentially an easement is a non-possessory interest in the land of another that entitles the owner of the interest to a limited use or enjoyment of the other's land and to protection from interference with this use. So there's multiple different types of easements. We're going to focus today on express easements, which are essentially those that are directly created and called out in a document or an agreement, rather than something that is created through other means. So express easements is that written instrument, and so that's partially why we wanted to focus on these, is that for a program like this, where you are working through a grant process, the other types of how easements can be created are not necessarily applicable. So we're looking at things where there's the express easement created by a written instrument that clearly states the intention of the parties to create that easement. There's two types of ways they function: affirmative easements and negative easements. Essentially an easement term that requires the easement owner to do certain acts on the piece of property that the easement is kind of speaking to is an affirmative easement. An easement that restrains the owner of that piece of property from doing something and making a particular use of the land is called a negative easement. And one instrument can create both of these. So an easement is both the instrument, but also the functionality of the instrument. They're typically created by, or at least when we're talking about express easements, through an express grant or a reservation. And a grant is essentially someone giving the right, so that's a separate instrument conveying those rights or obligations to another party. And then a reservation is typically withheld by the grantor for the benefit of a third party in a deed or for the grantor itself in the deed conveying the property. So that's something you'd see in a conveyance of fee simple, where there's an express statement in the deed that reserves, like typically you see it in access or other types of uses that way, that the grantor happens a lot when there's neighboring properties and they're conveying the separate one. So that's the reservation of the interest. And then there's the grant where they're specifically giving the right to someone else. When we think about easements in the context of land protection, we're often thinking about them in this special world of conservation easements. Conservation easements are created as a function of statute. So they do have some more statutory obligations that have to be met for them to be considered a conservation easement and function in that manner. But essentially a conservation easement removes some of those sticks from the bundle that makes up fee simple ownership. And typically they have to be removed for specific purpose that is spoken to in the statute. So Oregon's conservation easement enabling statute does define what a conservation easement is. So we do have a specific definition of what that is. And you'll see it's very similar to kind of the definition of an easement in general, but there's for these specific purposes. So it is still a non-possessory interest in land of a holder, and we'll get to that term in a second because you'll have seen that throughout the rules as well. And it is a specifically defined term that imposes limitations or affirmative obligations. So again, going to that similar concept of just a general easement, and that they can either require the property owner to do something or keep them from acting in a certain way on their land. And the purpose is, which is important when we talk about conservation easements, because typically an easement in general can be for any purpose, legally, lawfully allowable purpose, but in a conservation easement in Oregon, they need to be for the purpose of retaining or protecting natural, scenic, or open space values of real property and ensuring its availability for agricultural, forest, recreational, or open space use, protecting natural resources, maintaining or enhancing air or water quality, or preserving the historical, architectural, archaeological, or cultural aspects of the property. And I did want to read all of those because it can seem quite broad, but each easement does have to provide evidence within the document as to meeting these requirements. And so you will see sometimes in the instruments creating a conservation easement, many of these enumerated, but there has to be some level of accompanying information within the instrument that explains what these resources are that it's protecting. So a recitation of just the purpose is not necessarily going to work. So going back to the term holder, so the conservation easement statute does also define what a holder, so who is eligible to hold and own a conservation easement in Oregon. And this can vary from state to state, but Oregon does specifically call out certain entities that are able and eligible to hold conservation easements. And so you'll notice that this is the same term that is referred to in the enabling statute for the drinking water source protection when it talks about partnership with a holder. And so we wanted to draw that connection a little bit here. So you can see it. It is in the context of a conservation easement statute, but we are using it in the rules a little bit to more define a type of entity as well as speak to conservation easements. So a holder under the conservation easement statute, and I'm not going to read all of this because there's a lot of words. You're welcome to go and look at this specifically, but this sub A basically speaks to public entities, the state, a county, metropolitan service district, soil and water conservation district, city or park and rec district, or a county service district. And then it goes on and has some specific language that I don't want to read entirely because it's not necessarily relevant. But I think it is important to think about this in the context of why a partnership may be important, in that not every entity and what we think of as a public entity may fall under what this definition states. Sub B essentially gets to your nonprofits, charitable corporation, charitable association, trust, etc. But it does say that the purpose of those entities need to be for retaining or protecting the natural and scenic open space values of real property. And so that kind of goes back to enumerating the same purposes for which a conservation easement can be developed. And then we do have in sub C an Indian tribe as defined in Oregon law. So those are the three types of entities that can hold a conservation easement in Oregon. Some other things defined in the Oregon Conservation Easement Statute, enabling statute, is that the instrument creating it may provide for a duration other than perpetual, but it is presumed that a conservation easement will last forever. And we can talk more about conservation easements, I think, later in the rule set, but so just moving on real quickly here to kind of other protective instruments. So again, the language of the statute refers to similar agreements. And so instead of listing out every type and possible instrument that could be created here, we did want to just kind of focus in on another term, which you might hear when talking about how to kind of control the use of property. And that's a deed restriction. And so a deed restriction is typically a promise or a covenant that's contained in the deed, and it imposes limits on the use or occupancy of real estate or the type and size, purpose, or location of improvements to be constructed on it. And this is typically created when the land is conveyed. And so again, it's contained in the deed rather than an agreement that is separately and created outside of the context of a conveyance. Deed restriction, the term is rather broad, and so you will hear it referred to often in times when it's not created through deed and conveyance, and but in concept, it's something that runs with and is on the deed for property. And I'm done. So happy to answer some high-level questions on any of that, or we can get into Steve's conversation, and that might bring some questions up for folks.
Maybe first, just any clarifying questions that RAC members have about what we understand is very heady information that Robin provided, but just any clarifying questions first before we ask Steve to share the rhododendron experience. Okay, seeing none, Steve, be happy to have you share what rhododendron's experience was going on, what, 3 years ago now?
Well, yeah, basically starting back in 2018. And I will attempt to make this as short as possible, but it is a lengthy diatribe on everything that took place, because it was quite convoluted as we entered into the process. But the process really began when Julie Harvey and the people at DEQ provided Rhododendron Water with the updated source water protection assessment. And that was in 2018. And in 2018, I knew that Henry Creek, our water source, flowed through about 230 acres of private timberland. And that was pointed out in the source water assessment. And I knew that we needed to do something to protect that source water. And so I started the process of thinking of how it is we can approach the landowners and what kind of instruments we can provide them short of purchasing the land outright. But I had no idea how to do it. I mean, here I am, a neophyte to all of this. I'm just a volunteer president of a small water association, and I don't know all the ins and outs of all the legalese. And so I attempted to get some input from various different sources and attended a DEQ source water protection seminar that was held down at the coast that was very informative. And I started networking with people like Ben Dare from Sustainable Northwest, who knows more about this kind of thing than I did at the time. And so then in 2018, I knew about the source water protection grant, the 30,000 source water protection grant, and applied for that, knowing that we needed to do something. And we were awarded the $30,000 source water protection grant, and then I retained the services of Sustainable Northwest. And Ben and I then started the process of approaching the landowners to come up with some kind of a way to protect the source water. That was problematic because what it alerted me to is, at the time, the landowners were unwilling to negotiate any kind of a conservation easement or protection at all. And so here we were hit with one landowner that was totally unresponsive, the 150 acres, and another landowner that said, "Don't contact me ever again. I don't want to talk to you." When Ben Dare approached him, and here we were kind of left out in the open of not being able to protect our source water. And so that started in 2018, 2019, and early 2020, conversation with Representative Ann Williams, District 52 representative, and we started the process of House Bill 2594, which was a bill to get Oregon Health Authority to mandate that property owners enter into negotiations with water systems to protect source water. That went nowhere. It never got out of committee. And I was floundering at the time in 2018, 2019. And other than the $5,000 that we'd already paid Sustainable Northwest, the $30,000 source water protection grant just kind of went by the wayside because we couldn't do anything. Our hands were tied. Up until February of 2021, when I received word from the Forest Service that the 150-acre parcel of land that the trust that owned that never responded to our letters, said that they were putting that land up for sale. Well, as soon as I found out that that land was going up for sale, that started the ball rolling, because I knew they were selling it to be able to timber harvest that land. And at the time, we also knew what had happened in the Corbett Water District, where Corbett had their source water watershed logged to the Oregon Department of Forestry guidelines, with the setbacks that were set back with the Oregon Department of Forestry. And after the timber harvest, they lost 1/2 of their source water because it went underground after the timber harvest. And while they had another source of their water, half of their source water went away, and we have no other source. And I was worried that if our watershed was to be logged, we were running the risk of completely losing our entire source water if the same thing, because our watershed is very similar to the one that Corbett had. So when I found out that the 150 acres was going up for sale, that started the ball rolling rapidly. And I contacted a number of people, not knowing what to do. I contacted the Oregon Land Trust, the Trust for Public Lands, U.S. Forest Service, Western Rivers, the Conservation Fund, the just all kinds of sources to say what can we do? What are our options here? Because this land is going to be forested, and we run the risk of losing our watershed. And finally, after speaking with Nancy Derncrack for the Oregon Land Trusts, she put me in contact with Greg Fulham with Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt, and I was back in touch with Sustainable Northwest. And between Greg Fulham and Ben Dare and the people at Sustainable Northwest and me, we were able to contact the seller of the property and ultimately the final purchaser of the property. And they understood that we did need to protect our land, but they weren't going to do it for free. And so after lengthy conversations and negotiations and emails back and forth, fortunately, Greg Fulham with Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt was well versed on something that I'd never heard of, which was the equitable servitude. And I mean, we looked at conservation easements, but Rhododendron Water couldn't own a conservation easement. And according to Greg, the equitable servitude really would be the best way for us to go. But the equitable servitude, in a nutshell, is a deed restriction that we finally agreed on protecting our watershed on that 150 acres to where there was a 150-foot buffer to the south of Henry Creek and a no-cut buffer to the north of Henry Creek. And that would be written into the deed, and we would purchase that, and then it would be in the deed in perpetuity for any other property owners that might own that property, that they would be restricted by this equitable servitude that we had, or this deed restriction that we had. But then it came down to how much is that going to cost us, a purchase and sale agreement that we had to come up with. And because, I mean, we found out in February that the land was for sale, and in May they started logging. So between February and May, we were scrambling to try to come up with a way to protect our watershed. And with the equitable servitude, we had a timber cruise done, but the timber cruise was hired by Chilton Incorporated, which was the owner of the property at the time then. Did a timber cruise, and they came up with that we need to pay them, in my opinion, what ended up being ransom, but paid them $175,000 for the equitable servitude. And that was then a purchase and sale agreement for the equitable servitude. And we had the attorney write in all of the property meets and bounds and everything that then spells out the protections along Henry Creek that the timber harvesters could not log in order to protect our watershed. I was looking for a 300-foot buffer. We ended up with a 150-foot buffer, and that 150-foot buffer ended up being just fine. But it was a lengthy process, and Rhododendron Water, with a $163,000 annual budget, didn't have $175,000 to pay pay Chilton this blood money, the equitable servitude, the purchase and sale agreement. And so we had to come up with various different funding options, which then again started me contacting the state and DEQ and the drinking water program, and coming up with various different options. And we finally agreed on a bridge loan from Craft 3 out of Astoria that funded the $175,000 once we closed the deal, the purchase and sale agreement for the equitable servitude. So they paid Chilton the $175,000, and Chilton was out of the picture. They could go ahead and start logging, but then that left me with, you know, how do we pay Craft 3 back on a 3-year interest-only 5% loan? How are we going to pay that $175,000 back to Craft 3? Well, then fortunately, Becky Bryant and Biz Oregon and John and several people came into play, and we were able to talk to the state, but the state was only willing to fund $100,000 of the $175,000, and so we started the ball rolling on that. And we had a $100,000 line of credit with the CoBank out of Colorado, so we tapped into the $75,000 of the $100,000 line of credit at CoBank. And we were able to, once the state drinking water revolving loan emergency fund of $100,000 came through, we were able to pay Craft 3 back part of the loan, and then the remaining $75,000 we paid for through a CoBank loan, a line of credit loan. But then CoBank called our loan, and we had to pay the $75,000 back to CoBank rapidly, because they were getting out of the water funding business. And so we then pulled the money out of the Rhododendron Capital Improvement Fund and paid CoBank back. And so here we are, without any capital improvement funds to improve our system. Chilton was able to log the 150 acres, and our watershed was protected. The deed is, it is written into the deed that whoever purchases that property it's incumbent upon them to protect our watershed the next time it's forested. You know, that's basically the long and short of the story. I mean, there's a lot more to it, because I tried to purchase the land after Chilton logged. I wanted to purchase the land, but that didn't happen, and it just went on and on. So we're still in the process of trying to be made whole, which is through my conversations with Ken Helm, the state representative from Beaverton, who is the chair of the water committee, and through conversations with OWEB and a tour that we did in Astoria, and my conversations with Ken, it got the ball rolling, which ended up being House Bill 2010 eventually. And here we are, trying to come up with rules to be able to make rhododendron water whole again. That's it in a nutshell. Any questions?
Thanks for sharing that, Steve, and thanks, Anne, for the comment in the chat. So questions for Robin or Steve from the RAC? Okay, hearing none. So a rationale with this is, one, we will be talking about a lot of those protective instrument terms that Robin walked us through in the PowerPoint as we get into the draft rules. So just wanting to make sure we have basic grounding on what different instruments provide. And then to Steve's point, we know there are a whole host of different water providers that might be contemplating something like fee simple. And there are instances where that may not be possible for a whole host of reasons. So hearing Steve's experience, rhododendron's experience, we thought was helpful grounding. And also, again, as we walk through the draft rules and recognizing we have different funding sources that may have different requirements or expectations, being able to think through what's the practical on the ground reality and how do we then consider kind of what fits relative to the program requirements and expectations by statute, the different funding sources, best practices for all of you as water suppliers or nonprofits that might engage as holders, technical experts. So just having some of that background before we start walking through the rules. A few pieces that I'll mention before we transition into the review of the rules. One is that I mentioned the bond funding presentation from DAS during our last RAC, which was incredibly helpful. We have done some follow-up and are getting some what I would call refined information from DAS about different aspects of bond funding and what requirements may be, what allowables, disallowables might be. One piece that we've learned, we're waiting for final confirmation, is that initially our understanding was fee simple and conservation easements were the only protective instruments that would be eligible for bond funding. Again, waiting for final word on this, but it does sound as though other types of protective instruments may be eligible also for bond funded grants as long as they are perpetual in nature and run with the land. So that is helpful to know, given that $4 million of the funding for this program is bond fund, 1 million is general fund. So just, I'm sharing that knowing final word is not available yet, but that sounds like a promising development. As we kind of get into the rule language, I think Robin will help flag some kind of questions and considerations for the RAC. If that does, if those requirements of perpetual and running with the land help make something available for bond funding, is this something that should be considered for all potential projects coming into as proposed projects for this grant program? So just wanted to flag that piece. And then as Robin mentioned, just kind of working through this question for any potential easement projects that might be eligible for the program, given the list of eligible holders. How might we think through that? Some organizations, some entities are able to be holders, some are not. Just weighing out, especially in that partnership context, how easement projects could interface with this program. And then also, I think, consideration of assurances that might be needed for use of state funding, but what is sufficient enough in terms of protecting those conservation intentions around source water protection. So we'll get into some of that later, but just wanted to flag a few pieces. So I think Robin in particular, Robin, Audrey, Eric, anything else to highlight for the RAC members before we start walking through the rules? Okay. So the fun begins. Hopefully you all have had a chance to take a peek at the draft rules, but in terms of how we'll spend the next couple hours almost. So we will ask Audrey to screen share the Word version of the draft rules. We will walk through those. We'll, flag where we have certain rationale that we've brought to bear in terms of the draft rule, where we have adjusted content based on feedback from all of you. And then for particular discussion topics, as we hear the group discussing those topics, maybe starting to come to some common agreement, Audrey will start capturing either in common or maybe even in redlined text where we are flagging some potential revisions based on this conversation relative to what's already listed in draft rule. So you will definitely need to use your hand raise button. We won't be able to see all of you. And if for some reason staff are missing hand raise, just jump in and let us know that you have a comment or feedback to share. And then, as I mentioned, we hope to get as far as we possibly can, hopefully halfway through the rules, but we know these are important conversations. So we'll just walk through each of the sections of the rule set in order and see how far we get with things. So Eric Hartstein, anything you would want to add relative to just rule development process?
Maybe just one thing as we start to walk through. We'll get to the definition section shortly, but that will be a really important place to kind of keep in mind as you go through. If you see any terms that are confusing or you think may benefit from being defined, make sure you let us know.
Great, thanks for that. So any questions from RAC members before we start walking through the draft rules?
Will the rules be screen shared, or do I need to print out the rules?
Nope, they'll be screen shared. Audrey will screen share. Actually, maybe that's the perfect prompt. And let us know. So I oftentimes ask others, please zoom in a bit. Do folks need Audrey to zoom in a tad? Is that good? Okay. So we'll start from the top. And this will probably be a bit of a tag team among OWEB staff as we walk through different sections of the rule. So you'll see we do have the disclaimer at the top of the page noting that we still have feedback pending from both DAS and DOJ. So the rules may be subject to change. The Rules Advisory Committee is to do that, provide advice to the agency, and we'll make sure that in terms of legal and fund source requirements, the rules reflect all of the necessary components. So the purpose section, fairly straightforward, grounding the program in what is expected and required by statute for the Drinking Water Source Protection Program, outlining those protective instruments that Robin talked with us about just a bit ago, and really highlighting the intent is around benefiting source water areas for drinking water supplies and calling out specifically water suppliers. And that will kind of flow through as we get down to content such as eligible applicants. And then we did talk a fair amount in previous meetings about OWEB's Division 5, which are the kind of basic grounding rules for all of the agency's grant programs. Rather than restate a lot of content that is in Division 5 already of our rules, we are simply referencing Division 5. So that's really to keep things somewhat streamlined and knowing that we will have to make sure in program guidance that potential applicants know to reference over to that division of OWEB's rules. Yes, Steve, go ahead.
I'm curious about willing sellers, acquisition of lands from willing sellers. In our particular case, we had unwilling sellers initially. Is there at any point during this whole thing going to be any conversation about acquiring protections from unwilling sellers?
Not in the OWEB context, there will not be. So OWEB is non-regulatory in nature. We support voluntary conservation and restoration with willing landowners around the state. So as a grantor, that is not our role. So that piece of the bill language back in House Bill 2010 and now what is codified in statute is really a critical piece in terms of having this program sit with our agency. It's not to say, Steve, that in some subsequent conversations with DEQ or OHA that do regulate, that there couldn't be a different conversation under potentially a different program. But as it stands with the program sitting at OWEB, it will be based on willing sellers.
Thank you.
Yep. And Eric Hartstein, as policy coordinator, feel free to jump in at any point. Okay, so any questions, clarifications that you all would like to see in purpose? Okay, let's scroll down to definitions. So I won't be walking us through all of the definitions as written on the page, but you'll see we have really tried to highlight those terms that are specific and unique to this program. and used within this rule set. So Eric Hartstein, are there any particular definitions you would like to flag for folks, or any key differences compared to any of the other rule sets that OWEB has? And then Michelle, we can get to your question in just a second after I hear if Eric has anything he'd like to focus on.
I don't think so at this point, Renee, thanks.
Okay. Michelle, did you have a comment?
So conservation easement seems to be a definition for this program, and it narrows conservation easement just to that benefit source of drinking water. But protective instrument, I thought, might benefit from a similar narrowing. So adding that protective instrument for the purpose of benefiting a source of drinking water. I don't see it later kind of really explicitly called out that in the same way that conservation easement is, that these must be for that purpose. So just noting that parallel. Otherwise, alternatively, just having a conservation easement definition that ties back to OR 271. So.
Okay, before I go to, I think Stephanie had a comment, and then I see Julie's hand. Robin, any feedback or rationale or questions back to the RAC on that comment?
No, I think the comment makes sense for consistency, since, as Michelle pointed out, we do narrow the definition of easements beyond what they are in their statute. So I think for consistency, it makes sense.
Okay. Stephanie, did you have a question? I saw your hand go up and then down before we go to Julie. No. Okay. Julie, go ahead.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was
Stephanie.
muted. I've done this before. I'm sorry. I want to go back to the willing seller as a definition, because as Steve pointed out, and I know it's more like, well, it's probably more obvious to some people, but in Steve's case, they were willing at a price. And so if this is going to be to help, use rhododendron's example, make them whole under these rules, then, willing sellers, like, maybe you don't use condemnation, or but if you have to pay a lot of money, more than you want to, and the landowner is technically still willing.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. And we will, I think it's in application requirements if memory holds, which we may or may not get to today because it's a little ways down in the rule set. But we will need to be sure that we have guidance in rule to applicants about appraisal considerations and a reasonable value. Because I think, to your point, Stephanie, this is not something where public funding would be anticipated to be used for an unfair value that's being demanded by a particular willing seller or landowner. So we will have to contemplate that. Julie, not to jump you, but I suspect Robin has feedback on this particular topic.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a quick clarification or context setting that the term of willing seller is in the enabling legislation and in the statute. So it is something that we're kind of having to copy over for that regard. But I think thinking about it in that context of what is a willing seller is helpful, as Renee mentioned, for kind of how we look at what's required for the program.
So Stephanie, definitely as we get down into the section where cost value appraisal is captured, let's come back to that topic, because I do think it's important to be as clear as possible that this is not a situation where someone will be able to just name their price. We'll have to have grounding in a fair and reasonable value. given that this is public funding. Julie, go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like the definitions could benefit from the term drinking water source area. And I'm going to go ahead and just pop in the chat the reference to the OAR that has that in it. And so you guys can just copy it and put it in there however it works. But the catch is that in OHA's rules and regulations, it's an older term that we've used before called drinking water protection area. And we've really switched over to drinking water source area. And I think that's what should probably be used throughout this. So I think we could define a drinking water source area as the same as the drinking water protection area in OAR 333-061. And I just popped that in the chat so that you'd have it. So, and then I think that we can make that consistent in the language that follows once we have a definition here.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Julie. So other questions or comments on the definitions? Kristen?
Sorry, finding mute, unmute. Let me pull my notes back up. I just had a question in terms of formatting on some of them. For example, water system and water supplier, you're providing the language of the definition that's in statute. And I know holder's definition is long, but sort of in one, you're pointing to statute and giving the language versus the other, you're just pointing to statute, but not giving the language. Is there any problem with that, I guess, or rationale?
Robin, feel free to jump in. I think some of this was to save space to your point, Kristen, and this is absolutely something that we'll work through with DOJ, but Robin, any thoughts about that in particular on some of the terms that are defined in other statute?
Yeah, I don't think there's a problem with it from the context of like, because we did ask that question to DOJ and they said you can do either. So it's really just a ease of reading, but in particular, since holder is quite lengthy, we shortened it this way, but it is, a thing to consider from transparency and but there's not a problem with it being referenced either way.
Julie, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, my hand's still up, but I did ask on the term water supplier. Can that mean a group of domestic wells? And I need to probably look at that closer. I thought water supplier would be public water supplier, somebody who is regulated under Oregon law as a water supplier. But when I read this definition, I'm wondering if that might include a group of domestic well owners, which I don't think that is the intent of this. And that is the enabling legislation as well as water supplier. So I recognize that. And I might need to check with either OHA or I'm not sure who's enabling legislation that ORS is.
I believe it's OHA. Eric Hartstein, is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
That's OHA.
Yeah, Julie, if you could follow up, that would be helpful. Oh, Robin, were you saying something?
Yeah, so the definition is further in 448, which is the same rule or statute chapter that this program is in, and it's right under water systems, and it doesn't make the distinction on public in that definition that is specifically, so it might be something to consider adding outside of the definition and more in an eligibility or something like that, because I think we are confined to having to use the definition specifically as it is stated in the ORS, and it doesn't limit it by public.
That's what I was thinking. So let's be cognizant of that as we move forward.
Yeah, and thanks, Robin, for that. There are a couple instances where you'll see it's essentially a funnel, right? I mean, we're starting with definitions, then we're going to eligibility, and then ultimately we're going to be getting down to evaluation criteria, and not intending to have that funnel be so narrow that many projects fall out or are excluded. That's not the intent, but just that's generally the flow for the rule set. Okay, I think we had, Anne, I saw your hand up and then it went down. Did you have something?
I was just going to ask about, we just spent a half an hour going over the definitions of all those items and protective instruments. And I think the way it's written is very elegant because it doesn't go into all of those all the time. But I did wonder if there is are those terms are not, some of them I was familiar with, some of them not. Are those terms okay as is in rulemaking? So that's just my question.
Robin, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, they're okay in rulemaking as simplistic as they are because we go further and define requirements within any of them later on. I think if we were to define each one independently, it wouldn't necessarily be that useful because many of them have very technical differences that are hard to kind of put into practice through the definition. And so I think it's more about what is in the instrument and wanting to be somewhat broad in what types of instruments can be used in the program.
So, Anne, as we move down into eligibility criteria, that's where that is, correct, Robin?
I don't know if it's an eligible.
Well, or sorry, the protective instrument section, which we're not exactly sure what where that will live ultimately. Yes. Yeah, we can talk through, and I think to your lens, and maybe again this funnel situation, starting bigger and broader in definitions, and then getting clear on what is required within those. So let's make sure to put a pin in that to come back to.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Daniel, you had your hand up and then down before Kristen, so something to add?
No, you covered it.
Okay, great. Kristen?
Just on Julie's point that yes, the public piece is further narrowed down in eligible systems. So you do get there eventually, but I think it's a good point to sort of flag.
Yep.
As far as I'm reading it, the eligible systems do narrow it just to public systems, if I understand, and tribal systems. So
yep.
Later.
Thanks, Kristen. Michelle.
Thanks. I had a question about definition 8 on partnership, and it may kind of fill itself out later in the rules, and I'm not tracking it, but it suggests at the end that an eligible entity may form a partnership for the acquisition of any protective instrument, and that seems to exclude a partnership for just an acquisition in fee simple of property. I wanted to make sure that was intentional, that it was just kind of restricted to those protective instruments, which would be those deeds, covenants, conservation easements, and not a land trust ultimately owning a property. And I reviewed ORS HB 2010, and I didn't see that restriction in there.
So this, and I can just jump in there really quick. Yep. This is one of the challenges of having one definition to kind of refer to throughout, because we do include fee simple ownership in the definition of protective instrument. So the intent is that the partnership could be for any of those, recognizing that fee simple ownership is not necessarily an instrument, but it was kind of our best way of including it in a holistic definition.
Sorry, my brain skipped over it. I'm thinking of protective instrument as a different thing.
Yeah,
I ignored that part.
Totally understand that. And I think you'll see throughout that there are some times where we have to explicitly call out fee simple ownership as not being what we're talking about when we're talking about protective instruments. So I recognize it's a little bit challenging, but that was our attempt to be all encompassing when we talked about a specific term.
Thanks for that. Rhonda, I need to do a RAC process check as a non-RAC member. Could you hold your comment to public comment? Okay, thank you. Steve, go ahead.
I'm just kind of concerned under water supplier, as Julie pointed out. You know, it may or may not include a group of domestic well owners. If we exclude a group of domestic well owners as a water supplier, is there a vehicle for these small community water systems that are 6 or 7 members that are on a joint well for protecting their source water? Is there, other than this instrument, is there another instrument where they can protect their source water?
Thanks for that question, Steve. I think I'll lean on Julie and maybe Dan Brown. Any insights?
I can help just a little bit with that, later in the eligibility, we have Oregon very small systems identified. Those are not regulated under the federal drinking water, Safe Drinking Water Act, but are regulated under Oregon law. And those are any that serve more than 3 households, basically. So we are already getting at regulated as a public water system, anything that serves, over 3 households, basically, through doing that.
But is there funding available through instruments like what we're coming up with for them to protect their water system?
No, basically there's not. And
Okay.
that would be a set of individual, and that is, just part of Oregon law, that there is not a whole lot of help, to be honest, for domestic, individual, privately owned domestic drinking water intakes or wells. That is the responsibility of the property owner.
And I think, thanks for that question, Steve. I think part of our thinking as the agency developing rules and administering the program ultimately is to capture both, what the program design is to get at the intent of House Bill 2010 and now the associated statutes as the foundation for the program, but also capture where there may be challenges or gaps relative to topics that are coming up in rulemaking that we might hear about during public comment. And that could range from the amount of funding allocated to the program overall, the topic that you just raised. So we've already begun to capture some of those things, but we'll be sure to flag this piece for kind of those lessons learned out as we're going through rulemaking.
Right. As a little guy,
Yep.
I'm looking out for the little guy, and it's
Yeah.
these little water systems that have relatively little funding or access to funding that are going to need help, and that's my main concern. Just like us, I mean, we're a little system, and we need help in protecting our source water. And with only 365 connections, we're considered relatively small, as are those on wells with 6 or 7 households around a single well. So I'm just looking out for the little guy and seeing where we can go from here.
Yep. Thank you for that. Gabby, go ahead.
I just wanted to note that outside of the availability of public funding for those private well owners or small group domestic owners, they do have legal recourse through interference complaints with my department or kind of trespass with DEQ. So there are options, just not public funding available because they are private individual community, not community, they're private individual group domestic users. So they do have some recourse, but just not the public funding.
Yep. Thanks for that, Gabby. That's important clarification. Okay, Audrey, could you scroll when you're done? Yeah, perfect. There were, I guess, just a few other. So I think the only one that hadn't been on the screen for folks, I think, was number 9, right? Which honestly, the RAC does not have a whole heck of a lot of input on because that fund was established through legislation and now is documented in statute. Okay, so with that, we're going to move into protective instruments, and knowing that, as I just mentioned when Robin and I were talking about where does that piece sit, right now we have an entire section called protective instrument requirements where we start to flesh out the expectations of what would be included in these. We are not certain at all that the flow of this will stay as is. This could end up being something we deem eligibility. It could be something that's within application requirements. We just wanted to make sure we captured this important set of considerations. And the next time you see this, it may have a slightly different title and be sitting somewhere else. So that's just a flag. I think the other piece, again, there will be I'll probably lean on Robin to walk us through this part. But again, this emerging information from DAS about we may have more flexibility to use bond funding for these other instrument types if they are perpetual and run with the land. And then the question of easements and holders. I think another piece that we'll get to in this section is thinking through management plan requirements. And I mention that because that is a component of the original legislation. The legislation was clear on if a water supplier, whether or not they're in partnership with a holder, is not compliant with the intent of the legislation and associated funding, OWEB is not liable for that. The legislation did outline tools that the agency could utilize to, I think, have as much assurance as possible that the property will be managed in accordance with intent of the funding. And one of those was a management plan, development of a long-term management plan. So that's an area where you'll start to see some content, and I just wanted to tie it back to the enabling legislation. So I think, Robin, are you okay walking us through this part?
Yeah, so this area is a space where we tried to take those really broad concepts of different type of instruments that can be used to impact the use of land, and put down requirements for those that would meet the intent of the funding, but also give those assurances that Renee was mentioning in terms of protecting the land for the drinking water source. And so recognizing that, again, kind of to Michelle's point, that some of these instruments are different than others and trying to separate those out. So there may be some areas here where it's a bit convoluted. But we do start out with just saying that basically any protective instrument, and again, other than fee title, because fee title is a conveyance of all those bundles, or the entire bundle of sticks. And so there's not necessarily as big of a need for the instrument itself to call out specific rights. But that those instruments will essentially speak back to the purposes of the funding, and then give the entity that's holding those instruments some obligations as well for how they will administer their rights that they're granted in those instruments. So that's monitoring and enforcing. And then we do have some term language there about the requirement to repay the funds to OWEB if they do not enforce the terms of the protective instrument. And then some of these, the majority of these are more administrative. One of the things you'll see that's not included here is any specific terms about the management of the land. So that's not something that we've put down so far. This is more administrative to capture those kind of legal rights and administrative needs of the instruments. We do speak to duration if you look down at E. And so this is an area that I think will be important to consider in the context of the information we got from DAS about currently, we do not say that we do not put a requirement that anything other than a conservation easement has to last in perpetuity. And as DAS informed us, for an instrument to be eligible for their funds, one of the requirements would be that it be perpetual in nature. So it's a consideration for the RAC to think about as to whether having something space for instruments that are not perpetual is important, or if having the consistency across the uses of funding or the funding available is more important. So keep that in mind as you're looking at the duration aspect. And then we wanted to add something in there about just the concept of the partnership and recognizing that a partnership can take many forms, including that the holder may be the entity that owns the protective instrument, for lack of a better term. And so just explaining the requirement that it's not just the water supplier that we would expect to include these items into an instrument, but that if a holder is going to hold that instrument, that they need to as well. And then we do have a little bit about fee simple acquisitions, and just essentially saying that we'll require the same things, but in a different format. And then we speak to the requirement for the long-term management plan for acquired lands. And so again, to Renee's point, that the statute and the legislation list a management plan as one way for OWEB to kind of make sure that the intent of the funding is being met. It does speak to it in the concept of acquired lands, which is what we think of in terms of fee simple. And we do want to give the RAC the opportunity to discuss whether you want to broaden that requirement and have it apply to any instrument that's speaking to the protection of a source water area. And then we do have that section about just kind of the statute and the legislation essentially speaking to what OWEB's ongoing responsibilities are, and kind of that liability protection there. And then subsequent conveyances, we do have requirements from DAS about how those are treated for bond funding. So if the instrument acquired using these funds is later conveyed to a different entity. So if a water provider is the initial owner of, say, an equitable servitude, but then for whatever reason, it no longer can administer that and it wants to convey it to another entity, for that to happen, there is a certain process that would have to go through, and that is subject to OWEB process as well as DAS process for bond funding. And I think so that gets to the end of the protective instruments. And so again, as Renee mentioned, we wanted to confine this into one spot so we could think about it in the context of the instruments, but it doesn't have to live here. If there's other spaces within the rule set that might be a better fit for some of these terms, let us know what you're thinking there and we can add that into the notes.
And with that, pause your thinking on that, because again, I'm so excited to have the RAC walk through the draft rules that I am 5-6 minutes late now and having us take a break. So thank you, Eric Hartstein, for the reminder. So thanks, Robin, for the overview of this. Are folks comfortable with a 10-minute break, coming back at about 10:31, and then we can jump back into questions, feedback, thoughts that you all have about the protective instruments section? Okay. All right, so we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Thank you. All right, welcome back, folks. We'll give another minute. Eric Hartstein, did you have a comment?
Yeah, thanks, Renee.
Yep.
I just wanted to let folks know that, we're asking some, fairly technical questions and trying to get some good feedback at this meeting. This won't be your only crack at these sections here. So if you'd like to think about your response, we'll be revisiting this at the next meeting as well, with revisions that have been made after this meeting, but we'll have an opportunity to talk things through with the RAC as well at future meetings.
Yeah, thanks for that, Eric. These are definitely some deep and complex topics. So I think maybe what we'll do, Audrey has screen shared, the initial portion of the protective instruments requirement section that Robin walked us through. I may, for full transparency, ask one or two RAC members to share their insights and experience. Michelle in particular, I'm thinking you might have feedback to share based on land transactions, discussions that land trusts around the state might be engaged in with water suppliers or local municipalities, just to kick off the conversation. So hopefully me talking this amount of time gave you a little time to think through if you might want to share something. And also happy to answer questions if folks have questions about the content here. So Dan Brown.
I just wanted to follow up. I think for the protective instrument requirements, we had talked about there's sort of a managing the acquisition piece that's not included in the protective instrument requirements, except for this, we'll monitor the property at least annually and enforce the terms. So I didn't know like how the management part for protection of water quality was segregated out of this. And I just wanted to tie that down to the evaluation criteria 7, which does talk about sort of the long-term management, but it seems that there it's limited to applicants with partnerships. And so anyways, it's just a thought. It's like, where does that management piece live if not up here?
Robin, do you want to speak to the management plan portion that is in this section?
Yeah, so that's a great way to tee up that conversation, Dan, because the management plan would be kind of the way that we would get at that. And so right now we have that confined to just a fee title acquisition. So there is space to add it into a requirement for other protective instruments. And then we also have our definition of what a long-term management plan will be as being pretty broad and not prescriptive. So there's space for the RAC to discuss whether having more outlines around specific management of the property would be appropriate, and I guess whether adding a requirement for a management plan that is reviewed and approved goes into the other instruments. And then I do think, Dan, I just want to clarify that you were also adding kind of a question about not seeing a tie to the purpose of those, like the protect, enhance, and restore language in the protective instruments. Was that something you were noting too, or did I read into your comment?
Oops, yes. Wait, I might have missed what section is this in that you're showing on the screen right now? Okay, protective instrument requirements, sorry. Yeah, it was down in the, and we don't have to jump there now. I just noticed that in the evaluation criteria, number 7, there was some, demonstration of capacity for doing management, but it didn't seem to apply to all applicants, only those applicants that form partnerships with eligible holders.
Yeah, thanks for catching that part, Dan. And we won't, I don't want to take us prematurely to the evaluation criteria, but this is part of our, I mean, frankly, it's been a little bit of a struggle internally of how much to put in the eligibility, even maybe the application requirements, and then how much to put in the evaluation criteria. So we absolutely are going to want to spend some time with the RAC talking through how much should be ported down or redundantly stated in a good way between eligibility, application requirements, and then again in evaluation criteria. And frankly, in evaluation criteria, do we need to flesh out even more or raise the bar some on certain sections of the evaluation criteria? But I think going to the question that Robin teed up, and I think you kind of zoomed in on. So right now, Audrey, if you could scroll back up to the protective instruments, right now, in terms of that management plan expectation, that is limited to only fee acquisitions. It is not associated with these other instruments. So are there thoughts, opinions about that from the RAC? Is that going far enough? Is that not going far enough? Do we run a risk of not meeting the expectations of protecting drinking water, source water area? Go ahead, Daniel.
That's a really good question. I worry that if we're talking about a water supplier that's pretty limited in capacity, they might be more likely to rely on a conservation easement or other type of protective instrument. And that would go hand in hand with a limited ability to pull together a forest management plan. And so I don't know yet how I feel about not including a forest management plan or a management plan in the protective instruments section. But that's just something I want to call out, is like, maybe if someone is leaning on a easement, that's because they don't have that capacity to take on the management and ownership in a way that a forest management plan, is a key part of that.
Michelle?
I think so for the fee simple acquisition, I think a management plan is entirely appropriate and something that should be a part of the grant program. For conservation easements, I think that can be an important component depending on kind of what the conservation easement covers. And similarly for deed restrictions, it could be something that is appropriate, but there are some, I could see a deed restriction. Sorry, it's telling me to lower my hand. I could see certain circumstances where a deed restriction might just increase a forest buffer, so not allow harvest within a buffer. Steve, I'll go back to your example, in which case a forest management plan really doesn't, I don't see that kind of as a necessary piece of ensuring that that buffer is protected. So I guess there's more nuance to me in the non-fee simple protective instruments. I'll start using the language of when that management plan might be applicable. So maybe not in the requirements, kind of the per se requirements for all protective instruments, but instead kind of part of some other requirements or a ranking. So I'll leave it there.
Kristen?
The way it's written now, at least under fee title, it just says long-term management plan. And I don't know if that's implied that it's a forest management plan or could be different depending on the instrument. I mean, if the purpose is to protect, there's a pretty specific purpose for these instruments. And I personally would like to see some sort of documented intention of how whatever management or restriction or instrument is used, it's going to be used in a way to achieve the purpose of the program, whether it's easement or restriction. And I think the capacity question is important, and it might not need to be a giant forest management plan as we're traditionally thinking about them. But if they, frankly, if they don't have the capacity to make a plan, then do they have the capacity to manage these lands in perpetuity for the purposes of the program? Would be a question I would ask. So.
Thanks, Kristen. Gabby, you had your hand up.
I think I just want to echo Kristen's thoughts. I think the way it's written now allows for some flexibility of the level of detail or thoroughness of what that plan would require. And I think it's reasonable to expect if public funds are used for that purpose, that the applicant would need to demonstrate that they intend, and they can write the management plan in accordance with their capacity and funding. So I think it's reasonable to expect as well.
Thanks, Gabby. So let me pose this question back to the group. It sounds as though there are pieces of what you're seeing here that many of you agree with. It sounds as though you recognize there could be nuance, both in terms of the protective instrument used and the reasonable associated kind of management that could be expected from those. And it does sound like you might still want to see something, not necessarily something that is overkill relative to management for a particular instrument type, but that would help ensure delivery on funding intention of this public funding. So I can only see a few of you, so head nod. So I think probably if you don't agree with that assessment, let us know. And knowing Daniel, that may be a bit counter to what you said, given if they don't have the capacity to do more than a deed restriction, maybe they don't have the capacity for management, but I'm hearing a little bit of rub on appropriate use of public funding though with that. Steve.
I'm looking at 2A and record on title a notice of funding that includes 1 through D above and develop a long-term management plan for acquired land, which is kind of what we're talking about. What if we add on A past and where applicable develop a long-term management plan? Because in like we didn't need to develop a long-term management plan. It's already developed. And so it's not applicable. But if we put a disclaimer in there, where applicable, develop a long-term management plan. I'm just saying.
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. I think, so yes, thanks for capturing that nuance. I do think we may need to, since this section, then this sub 2 is focused on fee simple only, I think we may need to revisit if that is too narrow, given some of what I heard around, like what Michelle said for easements, and then Steve, even for what you said for something like an equitable servitude, we may need to pull up from that focus on fee simple, but create that space for nuance, given the different instrument types. Michelle.
I guess I don't have a solution right now, but I'll just flag, I'm not sure a management plan for kind of all non-fee simple protective instruments would be anyway, would make sense or be appropriate in all instances. And so I continue to wonder if that should be included in this particular section, which seems to be describing what would be in the actual deed restriction language, you would need these components to be in that deed restriction. And I don't know that I would put within that deed restriction language, you need to kind of provide for a management plan. So I'll need to do some thinking on that, but I'll just flag that I'm not sure that I would want to broaden that deed restriction language or protective instruments, not a fee simple acquisition, to include a requirement around a management plan, just given that I can see a lot of circumstances where that wouldn't be appropriate.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. Dan?
And I would say that I agree with everything Michelle said. My curiosity here is in, well, like going back to Steve's sort of discussion earlier, how, they wanted a deed restriction, conservation easement. I forget what mechanism they used in rhododendron, but originally they wanted 300 feet, right? And they only got 150 feet. The question I would have is if it's a fee title acquisition, OWEB is going to be able, through this process, ensure through a management plan requirement, et cetera, that it's going to meet the objective. Where does OWEB get that sort of check box on a conservation easement? Like, if it's only 5 feet, is that enough to meet the water quality objectives? Is there, what are the, what do we need? What does OWEB need to see to have confidence that the conservation easement is going to meet the water quality objective? And then once it's built in there, then I agree with Michelle, then it's, just make sure it's sort of being enforced. I don't know does that make sense, Michelle, and everybody else, I guess?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Dan?
Go ahead, Steve.
When we went after our equitable servitude instead of a conservation easement, but when we went for the equitable servitude and I was asking for 300 feet, it was at a time when the Oregon Forest Practices Act was inadequate with the current boundaries for riparian protection. However, since the private timber accord has come into place, had that been in place when rhododendron was going through all of this, we wouldn't have even had to have purchased the equitable servitude, because the new boundaries for riparian protection zones is more than adequate. But at the time, it wasn't. And so, with the private timber accord now, with the larger riparian protection zones, a lot of this is basically a moot point for some of the watersheds.
Thanks, Steve, for that historic context. I want to try to capture what I've heard. So I think that the OWEB team needs to take a look at this section and think through relative to the management plan component. Does this fit here? One, where it might fit elsewhere, still signaling an expectation and maybe kind of a tiered or nuanced expectation for a management plan, depending on the type of instrument. Holding space for that, but it may not live in the protective instrument section. 1, 2, I think that, to Dan Brown's point, we are in evaluation criteria, and this will not be able to be precise because each situation may be slightly different, but we will have to give enough signal on what is needed, what is the expectation of the type of longer term management that would meet that bar, so that folks have a sense of what they need to submit with an application, what evaluation criteria might look like. So I'm just putting a pin in that relative to evaluation criteria. An important note, we've used the term long-term management plan here because that was written in House Bill 2010 in terms of the connection to how OWEB will ensure that an applicant or ultimately a grantee does meet that requirement and is responsible for delivering on that. So I think we'll think through that term of art relative to the statutory language and what the expectation is. So those are a few things just to kind of capture what we've talked about. I do have a question, and this probably, Julie, is for you and maybe Dan Brown too. As we think about part of the intent of this funding, I do believe is to help leverage other available funding, like maybe federal funding that could be out there. What are other programs doing or requiring, if anything, related to documentation around long-term management, like Clean Water SRF, Julie, or Dan, some of the other federal programs that EPA is supporting?
Yeah, definitely the clean water, in order to get funding through the Clean Water SRF, you would have to show a reduction or a minimization of non-point source pollution. And the stewardship plan is a big piece of that. They have to show that they will be managing it to reduce non-point source pollution, and that has to be in an sort of adopted plan or, you know, something like that. So that definitely makes sense in this case. I'm leaning towards calling these more like a forest resource stewardship plan, as opposed to a management plan. But if it's in the initial language of, you know, management plan, then obviously you need to continue that. But I think of it as a stewardship plan, even more than a forest management plan. Do you have any other thoughts, Dan, on other federal funding? And maybe, and I'm thinking maybe Daniel, because you guys have accessed like Forest Legacy grants and others, do they require a stewardship as well?
I was going to hop in. So Forest Legacy and the community forest grants, they require a forest management plan. It doesn't need to be finalized, but it needs to be in process or showing the capacity to develop one. So there's definitely been, like, folks have secured Forest Legacy funding, and while they've been sitting on that funding, then gone out and developed a forest management plan.
Thanks for that. Dan Brown, did you have something to add too?
Nope. On the SRF, again, that's sort of EPA gives the money to the state, and then the state sort of manages that outflow. So it's all EPA and DEQ, I think, are pretty one and the same in this situation.
Okay. Michelle, go ahead.
And I just want to be careful in thinking about when we're talking about a fee acquisition under those programs, or kind of an easement, usually is what those other programs would fund, not that deed restriction. But in the conservation or deed restriction context, I'll just use that deed restriction as like an umbrella term. It is the property owner that continues to kind of own and manage that property. So it would be a slightly different situation for a management plan than if it was the holder that owned that property. So anyway, just kind of making sure that nuance is captured when we're thinking about kind of what requirements to place on the water supplier or partner holder, and what that plan would look like.
So Michelle, thanks for that. And can we talk a little bit about conservation easements? Because in my less experience than several of you minds, I mean, that is kind of this in-between space for me. There's fee simple, there might be deed restrictions, there might be something like the equitable servitude that Steve described. Easements feel like this middle ground. And Michelle, given what you just described, that there is still a landowner who has that property on top of which we've placed a conservation easement for the purpose of helping to protect a source water area. Like, I'd love to play out a scenario of what would that middle ground look like from your perspectives to meet the intent of this funding, but recognize that you don't have full control over that property.
The way, and Robin, please chime in here as well. The way, you know, I've seen management plans used with conservation easement. So the conservation easement would set out within its terms, kind of, at least the trend that I've seen is kind of broader restrictions on the use of property to meet the conservation goals. And then management plans can be used kind of to provide that next level of detail, and they're done in partnership with the landowner. And so the easement may provide, I don't know, it could be really broad, land management to kind of protect drinking water sources. That's broader than it would be, but I'll just use that as an example. And then the easement would say, you know, every 5 years we'll enter in a management plan cooperatively, and that would lay out in more detail kind of the types of harvest, timber harvest, and I'll use the timber context because that's where my brain has been working a lot, or kind of specific pesticide use that might be allowed for this management period. And all that would then be under the umbrella of that requirement under the conservation easement terms. So it would always be consistent with that. And the way I've seen those management plans used is that they provide, they allow management of the property to kind of evolve over time and move with kind of best practices. And conservation easements that are too restrictive can kind of sometimes be stuck in a particular time period and may miss some evolution that may turn into a better way of managing land or evolving understanding of that. And so that's kind of where a role for a management plan can be in a conservation easement context. It would be possible in a deed restriction context. I guess I haven't wrapped my head around kind of what that would be. I've typically kind of thought of deed restrictions as a more narrow set of restrictions and not covering kind of a broader property interest. So I just need to think about what that would be, what would look like in that context. So it could be similar. So I don't know if that answered the question. And Robin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think just to that last point of, so again, recognizing that a conservation easement can only be held by a certain type of entity, and another instrument, as kind of Steve laid out, where they determined that they were not eligible as a holder, and so they went the route of an equitable servitude. In part, that was part of the reason. But so in thinking of the context of a conservation easement management plan interaction that Michelle just laid out, which was, I think, a great way of describing kind of how those tools function together. And some of these other instruments, they could function similarly, and just be that the instrument that is on the deed is different, but the management plan could be incorporated similarly.
Okay, thanks. Yep, go ahead, Michelle. And then Kristen, we'll come to you.
And I guess the kind of role of the management plan depends on kind of the property interest that is held by the conservation easement holder or is restricted by the deed restriction or equitable servitude or other covenants. So that, depending on what that document is doing, there may be a role for a management plan, or there may not be in the case of rhododendrons, just expanded buffer. But I think that there is a place for ensuring that the goals of the program are being met by kind of ensuring that the terms of the deed restriction or conservation easement are sufficiently protective of those goals, and so that provides an assurance. Unlike in the fee simple, there's no, that management plan provides that kind of level of assurance that the goals of the program are going to be met going forward. I don't know if that last piece made sense, folks. Robin, I see you nodding, but
I think it does. Yep, go ahead, Robin.
I think that's a really good distinction to call out, and does, well, Renee, you might have been going the same way I will, so I'll let you go.
Well, I was going to go to Kristen, so.
Well, it's part of this conversation. Thanks. Just a follow up to your question, Renee, to Michelle, and on the conservation easement. Michelle, when you see those plans, does it you talked about the different details of actions, and is it typically the conservation holder that is implementing those actions, or still the landowner, or how does it define whose responsibility those actions are, and whose responsibility typically is it in that scenario?
The management of the property remains with the property owner. And generally there may be some circumstances where the easement holder would do some stewardship work and partner with the landowner, but generally that management, the conservation easement holder is working with the landowner to set up a management plan for the landowner's use of the property to ensure consistency with the terms of the easement. But it's ultimately the landowner that is implementing those. So in an agricultural context, it would be the management plan would lay out where you could harvest, what types of crops, tilling, no tilling, and that would set what the landowner is doing with the property.
Thank you.
Robin, tell us where you were starting to go.
Yeah, so some of the concepts that Michelle spoke about in terms of like what the easement includes. So making sure that the easement terms meet the purposes of the funding, that there's appropriate restrictions and reserved rights. Typically, OWEB deals with that in a very generalized funding condition for our grant agreements. So I think that's something that we can keep in mind as we're talking about this, that there's other ways to get to some of these goals and needs that are specific to certain projects outside of the context of prescribing them in rule. And so that's something that sometimes we lay out in guidance. Still wanting to give folks who are applying to the program enough of that understanding of what we're looking for and what we will require, but there's some things that might just be so nuanced and specific to certain types of instruments and certain types of properties that might be better dealt with in a grant agreement that's based off of the application that's presented to OWEB at the time. And that's typically a way that we've interacted with that. Like if a grantee or an application states that they're going to do a management plan and they lay out all these things they're going to do, then we would have in our grant agreement, if that is awarded funds, basically a requirement that they do what they said they were going to do in their application, because that's why they were given the funds in the first place. So there are other ways, and typically that's kind of how we've approached it, is in specific conditions in a grant agreement. So just something to consider and keep in mind as you're kind of talking through how much really needs to be prescribed in rule, which is inflexible compared to how the program's administered.
Yep, thanks for that, Robin. And part of OWEB's work is to send enough of a signal or kind of guidepost for folks in rule that they generally understand, and that is not the only tool that we have available to do that. As Robin mentioned, it could be funding conditions in a grant agreement. We can more deeply outline it in guidance, but knowing that what our interest really as the grantor will be is to ensure that tools are in place to know that the funding is delivering the intent of the legislation. So that's, we'll try to not overly burden or narrow things in rule, but potentially use some of those other tools. Dan Brown.
Yeah, I'm considering all that and everything I've heard. I'm just trying to figure out how to sort of simply make a recommendation for consideration, which would be on the screen here, we got protective instrument requirements, A, B, C. What if the first thing we had there was a demonstration of how the instrument was meeting the drinking water protection goals? I don't know if something like that could capture, like, we sort of need to see how this is gonna be beneficial, and then da. So I'm hearing Michelle in this area where actually I meant under ABC, so specific obligations of the grantee, including but not limited to And then the first thing up on the top there, yeah, right there would be sort of show us how this is sort of meeting the objective. And I do hear Michelle in the whole sort of arrangement. What we don't want to do is have something that's, you know, first of all, going back to Steve's story, you know, like the landowner doesn't really want to sell. Maybe you can do a conservation easement. And if that becomes too burdensome, then, you know, then they might just throw up their hands and be like, oh, forget it. So we don't want that, but we do need to see how this conservation easement is going to meet the sort of drinking water protection goals at some level.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That's super helpful. I do want to pose a question, and then Michelle will go to you. Given the feedback we've gotten from DAS about bond funding and the fact that bond funding could be used if these other protective instruments are perpetual and run with the land, I would be interested to hear the group's thoughts on, is that something that we would potentially want to require to maximize use of bond funding? Or is that something that we create space for, but we don't require given realities on the ground? So I'm saying that now, letting folks ponder. Michelle, go ahead with your question. It sounds like Daniel's already pondered, so he can go next after Michelle.
This is more of a, well, one thing I wanted to get clarity on was subsection 1. These are elements that are intended to be included in a deed restriction or conservation easement. And so I clarify that because it would show, like, be included as part of the deed in the public record. And just thinking about kind of where the appropriate space is for requirements that we're talking about in terms of management agreements and just wanting to keep that kind of what this is talking about versus kind of just general program requirements. And that's a clarity question that 1 was intended to have be requirements that are included in a notice of grant for the fee simple or for other protective agreements kind of in the deed restriction that's actually filed.
Robin, do you want to respond?
Yes, that is the intent of how this was written. I think, Michelle, you're correct in noting that there's some of the topics that have been discussed are a little bit outside of like what actually would be written into an instrument that is a deed. And so I think we can take some of this and put it into other sections around like requirements of the program rather than requirements that are written into an instrument that is recorded on a deed. But yes, that is the intent of how this was written.
Great, thanks for
Thank
that,
you.
Michelle. Okay, Daniel.
Yeah, Renee, based on the question you kind of floated out, it reminds me of the Washington State's Recreation and Conservation Office in their community forest program. They directly identify that property acquired with these grants must be kept in forest land forever. And so I think that that's something that could be helpful to reference back to, especially for fee title acquisition for the easement as you're floating. I think it makes sense because typically easements are established in perpetuity in the same way. But that's just something I wanted to bring up, especially as we move on to talking about fee title acquisition, is that other examples are for in perpetuity for keeping properties in forest land or within watershed management, water quality management.
I want to make sure I'm clear. So the RCO program for things like deed restrictions or covenant, it wouldn't be a term covenant in that case, that their program has a requirement that they're perpetual. Is that correct, or did I misunderstand?
For acquisition, it's in perpetuity as forest land.
Yeah.
I believe that they only cover easement. I'm not sure that they have as many options as this one might have.
Got it. Okay, thanks for that. Michelle, did you have a comment?
I just Washington statute actually provides that covenants and deed restrictions, so lesser instruments and conservation easements, can be protected in perpetuity. And Oregon doesn't have that statute, so they could be extinguished by a court in certain circumstances. So just drawing that distinction in Washington law, one might say they have a better system, but we don't have that kind of legal distinction called out. So there's a slight legal difference in how they treat the deed restrictions for conservation purposes.
Yeah, thanks for flagging that, Michelle. And I think the key for us in posing this question is this is really around funding, fund source requirements. And so if we could enable use of bond funding to the maximum degree possible, then we would build into this program a requirement potentially for deed restrictions, equitable servitudes, those being perpetual also. And it sounds like, you know, part of this is based on difference in law between the two states, but our thinking is really around that fund source question. And if that should be a requirement or just simply remain an option in this program. And Robin, if I'm not phrasing that question in a way that folks are understanding, feel free to clarify.
I think that the phrasing of it makes sense from how we're thinking about it and wanting to see if the funding, how the funding is delineated across the type of instruments makes sense. But I think the other question around this is there an interest or any reason like why these funds from either, well, from general fund, either even as an investment of public funds should go to instruments that are for a lesser duration than perpetual? So a 20, a 15, a 30-year agreement. There is an argument for landowner willingness, but from a competitive grant program where a perpetual agreement is going to have a leg up regardless, in some ways, is there a thought process on the benefit of leaving space for limited term instruments?
I mean, it seems like no. I mean, you're trying to protect water, drinking water, and I would assume you'd want to protect that drinking water for as long as people are drinking it. So maybe if the drinking, I mean, I don't know.
Daniel?
Yeah, when I think about what that would look like in reality, right, that's a bit of what Steve was dealing with, where he went to the landowner and said, like, how can we adjust your management approach? And so maybe that's, having someone go and extend their rotation age, or if we're talking about forest management, or have someone, be more selective with what they're harvesting up to, 15 years until there's a different forest type, right? There's like potential older growth, or a forest is transitioning to older growth where it is going to be a better water filter or a better filtration device. That feels really like a pretty niche example. And I don't know if kind of having something on record to allow that, like it is good flexibility, but I don't know how many of those types of agreements will come out of this.
Thanks, Daniel. Eric Hartstein?
Yeah, it's a great discussion. I think given Steve's comments about the difference in regulations that occurred over the past 5 years also could play a role here. If there is a agreement for 15, 20, 30 years, and during that time period, regulations change, and maybe the required buffer size is increased. That might be more attractive to a landowner that would be willing to enter into agreement. So just a thought.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, without question, we could hold space for something that would be shorter term than perpetual in nature, and I think, though, to Dan's point, then you run the risk of 20 years down the road, your water supply isn't protected. Maybe it isn't something we determine in the protective instrument requirement or eligibility, and maybe it is something rather that the RAC suggests a preference on an evaluation criteria, that perpetual would be preferred over a term instrument of some sort. So we could contemplate structuring it that way. We did just want to raise the question because of the new information related to bond funding. So if it's the pleasure of the group for us to think about tackling that in evaluation criteria, but not shutting out the option in eligibility, we can go that route for you all to chew on at the next meeting. And I can only see Daniel and Eric, and I'm seeing a little bit of head nodding. So if anyone has concerns, please speak up. Okay. Robin, do we want to circle back to the question of a conservation easement and the fact that there are a limited set of entities that are able to hold easements? And who might that be?
Yeah, so I'll try and lay this out in a way that is non-convoluted, but so in thinking of the context of partnership again, and for certain partnerships where the water provider or since they are the grantee may not be the entity that is acquiring the property, so a conservation or so a holder would be, so in this case like a land trust or something would acquire the property and fee. We have this language in here that there would be this notice of funding, and so that would be any entity acquiring in fee. But we do have, I guess back to kind of some of the language and concerns around specific management obligations and making sure that a fee interest is being managed or appropriately monitored. Is a notice of funding enough, or is there an entity that should a conservation easement be required on properties held in fee to be and held by an entity like OWEB, like we do in our traditional land acquisition program? Or should there be some other mechanism to make sure that a fee acquisition is similarly being monitored for the being used for the purposes of the funding? So like what Daniel had mentioned in terms of that, a requirement that it be forever in forest land. If there's no entity monitoring that, does that raise concern amongst the RAC members? And I can try and state it another way if that's helpful, because it's kind of a convoluted question. But.
Well, and this might be a space where I don't know if Michelle or Daniel or Anne or Stephanie, as your either organizations or partner organizations or your jurisdictions, your municipalities are contemplating this, like, how are you thinking about the structure of a partnership? Are you even contemplating this issue of of a holder for an easement if you're talking about a fee transaction. Michelle?
I have a few thoughts, but I want to let Anne or Stephanie chime in first. So I just want to make sure that they're not.
I would just say that we have contemplated working with a holder, and it sort of depends on the holder having capacity and us having capacity. So I guess since it was not a requirement of the project we were working on, and then we may have the option to work with this grant source to develop it. We will be, I mean, that would be we would need that, absolutely.
Okay, thanks for that, Anne.
Yeah, same for me or for us, but this has been eye-opening in terms of we were so far focused or mostly thinking about fee simple purchase. We weren't looking at any of these other instruments and methods. So that's all.
Yeah, and I would just to follow up on what you were saying, Stephanie, I think it's going to be a hard, because there's so many with low capacity systems like a little city, the high priority is to secure and safeguard the land. And then going back to get the conservation easement is going to be a lot of work to do that, you know, may be important in the long run, but it may be that other things will be higher priorities for us, like if another piece of land came up or, you know, so just to be realistic about that. Anyway.
All right. Thanks, Anne.
So the barrier factor might be important to consider for that sort of scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that from both of you, Anne and Stephanie. Michelle, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, and thanks, Anne and Stephanie, for sharing that. I would tend to, well, one, acknowledging the importance of having some sort of overlying protection for an interest acquired under the program to ensure that the land or whatever interest is acquired using the funds is managed to protect drinking water. There's certainly, just because a community owns land doesn't mean it will be managed consistent with drinking water goals. And so I think some form of requirement is important to ensure that value continues to be protected. I think a notice of grant is kind of hits the sweet spot in terms of having those requirements kind of on notice, having them to be enforceable, at least as they're currently written. OWEB would have a right to go on and kind of monitor and confirm. With the fee simple, there's that management plan requirement, which provides another layer. And then there's a requirement around repaying funds in the event that the interest isn't managed consistent with those notice of grant requirements. So I think those layers provide the appropriate level of protection, and conservation easement can, I think it kind of adds a layer of complexity that is unnecessary and kind of may overly complicate kind of getting the money out and being flexible enough to reach the community, to make it accessible to the communities that I see as most needing this funding and support. So that'll be my my position on kind of whether a conservation easement is required, or I think the current framework is helpful. And I'll just add in, like, the other examples I've seen, the limited examples I've seen, deed restrictions have been used with clean water SRF programs that do land acquisition for drinking water protection. So that's the model. That notice of grant is kind of the model that I've seen used. Thanks.
Thanks for that. It's super helpful, Michelle. Thoughts from others? Kristen.
Thanks. That's really helpful, Michelle, and I support that too, of having some layer of protection, like you said. Is there in fee title, so if a water system acquires a property, is there a restriction on, I mean, obviously their interest is keeping it and protecting their source water, but is there a similar protection for them not turning around and selling it again one day? Or how that works in terms of you bought this property and what happens one day if you want to sell it? Or does then that layer of protection just stay on that property even if they do turn around and sell it at some point?
I can answer one part, and then I think I need Robin probably to chime in on the second. So one is, I think it might be if you scroll down just a tad, Audrey, please. Okay, so subsequent conveyances. And then, so it's talking specifically about notices, and I think maybe farther down also with sale and transfer. So because funding specifically attached to this drinking water source protection program would be used, then any potential sale or transfer would need to be reviewed and approved not only by OWEB as the granting agency, but also by DAS if it's bond funded rather than general fund. So that is one piece. If you then play that out to say, well, what happens if you say no? I don't know what happens if we say no, that it no longer is compliant with the intent of the funding, because we haven't been there. But that is why that both notification and review approval is needed. I think on the, I guess, Robin, just other thoughts related to Kristen's questions.
Yeah, so that's part of the requirement that the deed restriction or like the notice of grant would be recorded on title, and there would be a provision in there that essentially says that this runs with the land and that would survive transfer. So every future transfer of that underlying property would continue to be similarly impacted by the restrictions.
So again, I know this is a lot to take in. I think just what Michelle shared around the conservation easements potentially being on top of fee, potentially overcomplicating things, as opposed to what we have built in already in terms of the notice. Just other thoughts, different opinions, concurrences with what Michelle shared. Yeah, Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, I agree with everything Michelle shared. We've definitely seen an interest, especially if you're thinking about city councils and the turnover between city councils or water district management, that the priority will, I think, seems to be fee title acquisition. And following that acquisition, it's like, okay, we've done this first step. If we still have capacity to put a conservation easement on it, just so that any change in leadership or change in kind of budget stipulation won't have a direct impact on the water quality itself. So I think that the way that what Michelle said makes a lot of sense, that, that's an interest, but it comes down to capacity as well. So yeah, I guess people are definitely, like, it's on their mind, but I think, especially if the funding is available, whether it's through this or through other programs, the priority is certainly seems to be fee title acquisition. And if an easement is in place to follow that, that ends up just being a benefit. But to be like a less intense checks and balance is kind of a 10-year forest management plan, or a long-term management plan that requires being updated, or at least, signed off by new leadership. That might be something that you could look into, of, rather than have it be a 40-year or 100-year forest management plan. Sorry, management plan, not necessarily a forest management plan, but have that be every 10 years. I think that's what the Forest Legacy program does, if not a lot of other programs. I know that's just typically 10 years is when any forest landowner will update their management plan.
Super helpful, Daniel. Thanks. Michelle?
Sorry, I know I feel like my voice is a little heavy at this RAC, so apologies, but I just wanted to, I forgot to kind of make the point that certainly a community, and wanting to make sure that the rules provide the ability of a community to have a conservation easement or deed restriction on a fee title property acquired under the program. And just to be careful that there's nothing in the notice of deed restriction requirements that would kind of preclude that or complicate that. because certainly if a community wants to have that as an additional layer of protection, that's up to the community and can have a lot of benefits. So thanks, Daniel, for bringing that up and prompting me. It was on my notes and I forgot to mention that point is just kind of the nuance of making sure that that's it's important and want to make sure it's allowed. So.
Thanks, Michelle. I think I probably would ask, I guess, Julie and Dan Brown and like the example that Daniel just made on Forest Legacy, if you could help cross-check this with other funding programs too, I think that's useful because we're not building this to absolutely 100% align perfectly with Clean Water SRF and to the maximum degree possible that we are able to have similar things that folks are aiming for. We'd like to do that. So I guess just, Julie, if you're seeing or hearing anything in these discussions that feels counter to in a way that will be unhelpful, the requirements of other funding programs, please let us know.
Got it.
Okay.
Nothing,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say nothing to date, nothing yet.
Perfect. All right, we are at 11:32. I believe we are supposed to break soon, or maybe already we're supposed to have broken for a quick break. I want to do a check. I think Rhonda, you are the only observer still potentially on. So would you like to make a public comment after break? If so, just raise your hand or come on audio and let us know.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right. So folks, are you okay with breaking just for about 5 minutes till 11:38? Come back. We'll hear Rhonda's comments and then take a peek down at eligibility and come up with a game plan for next steps.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. We'll see you at 11:38. Thank you. All right, folks have just one more minute. We'll give them their full 5. All right, welcome back, everyone. Rhonda, thanks for hanging on with us. Eric Hartstein, I'll turn public comment over to you for summary of any written and other.
Okay, thanks, Renee. So we did not receive any written public comments in advance of the meeting. For future meetings, if we do get written public comment, we'll be sure to send it along to the RAC in advance of the meeting. Just one more check. I think, Rhonda, you're still the only interested public person on here. So if you do have public comment, feel free to speak up now.
All right, thank you. My name is Rhonda Nyseth, and I work for the Oregon Department of Human Services Office of Resilience and Emergency Management. And we are the agency that has been tasked with water delivery to folks impacted by disasters. And so we have been instrumental in the Klamath Water mission of delivering water tanks and water delivery to homeowners with impacted wells and dry wells here in Klamath. And then we've also done water delivery missions for nitrates up in La Guama as well, which is the Morro Umatilla water incident. And then we've also helped impacted communities, whether that they have failing water infrastructure, or the city's well stopped working for various reasons. We've done a lot of work in Warm Springs. So in listening to this, not sure that you're aware that we've been providing those supports, and that we are currently working on our own OARs to make sure that we're the lead agency in response to those water deliveries. So I'm not sure if I'm premature in my comments, but I just wanted to make sure that you all were aware.
Great.
Yeah, thanks, Rhonda. That's super helpful. And this program is focused on source water protection. So thinking about those lands that are providing, I mean, whether it's a surface water or groundwater source. But I do think just in the spirit of how can we in the state, well, I guess across jurisdictional boundaries in agency land, and thinking about different funding and support programs, helping to have a fuller picture is really important, knowing that our source water protection may be different from what your program, your DHS program is aiming for, but helping to point folks in the right direction. So we'll probably do some follow-up with you, just as especially as we get through rulemaking and are starting to put together program guidance in helping folks to understand kind of the resources out there and lay of the land.
Okay, perfect. Like I said, I just kind of wanted to make sure we were on the radar as you go through this work and start to continue with this service delivery.
Yep, fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for all that you're doing.
Thank you. You bet. If anybody has any more questions for me, do you want me to put my name and my contact info in the comments for you?
Yep, that would be fantastic.
You bet.
Thank you.
You guys have a great day.
You too. Okay. Thanks for that, Eric. Okay, so in terms of next steps, we don't have enough time to jump into eligibility, but what I am going to do is give us a quick glimpse into what we'll be starting to look at the next RAC meeting. We still have 2 RAC meetings left. I'm feeling optimistic that we will get through this full rule set in those 2 meetings, and we'll talk about where we are after the next meeting. So in terms of eligibility, we've got some different categories: eligible applicants, eligible properties, eligible systems. So as and again, we're not going to dig into these, but some pieces, for example, eligible applicants, that's fairly clearly defined by statute. We have, in a few instances, taken feedback that the RAC provided in past meetings. So for example, the population level here, some of the feedback about eligible properties, some of the parameters that we built around eligible systems, and those definitions we talked through last time. We've really tried to utilize that to begin to frame up the eligibility section. So we will dig into that next meeting. Hopefully it will move relatively smoothly and quickly because we've had some of these conversations before. And we'll spend the time that we need to talking through those pieces. If you scroll down just a little bit more, Audrey, perfect, thank you. We do have one other eligibility piece, the eligible maximum funding request. That is something we will want to talk through with you. I don't know that it will take a long time, but it's an important topic given that the statute does give us a cap of the maximum amount, and this group, I'm sure, may have thoughts on, is that the right number? Should that be lower? The same with matching contributions, which is the next section of rule, just thinking through what the interest is in having local partners be able to approach this program by not having too high a max amount, being mindful that I think some of the interest around the program was to provide non-federal match to other funding sources. So spending some time on matching contributions, and then you don't have to scroll through everything, Audrey. We have a whole set of things around application requirements, evaluation criteria that will take us a chunk of time, but we just wanted to give a glimpse of, you know, we'll start tackling this next set at the fourth meeting. Think we'll be able to move through them pretty quickly, knowing that things like evaluation criteria will take some time to walk through. All that said, we've already started to get some good feedback from all of you, I think, on, you know, how we can continue to flesh out the evaluation criteria pieces of the rules. And then knowing what Eric Hartstein mentioned earlier, all the feedback that you've provided today on these early portions, we will take back, digest, revise. So you will have another crack at that too. Hopefully each crack will take less time and there will be fewer discussion topics, but it's not as though that's in the rear view and you won't see it again. I think I'll pause there. Eric Hartstein, Audrey, Robin, anything to add on next steps?
Nothing for me.
Okay.
Renee, I do have one quick go back. I made a note up here just to finish a discussion of this protective instruments section and subsequent conveyances. We were talking about, you know, this piece of protective instrument, if it is subsequently transferred. Since there is that question of is protective instrument, you know, we define it as including fee simple, but then we have it kind of separated out between other than fee title and then fee title. Do we want to include a note of like, this includes fee title here as far as subsequent conveyance to make it clear? Or is that clarity not needed or not relevant?
It's a good catch, Audrey. I think what we'll have, and we can sort through it, some of it will depend on, I think one, just best practice with transactions. So Robin can chime in on that and we can do that offline during editing. The other piece though is related to the funding, because this portion does matter to DAS relative to bond funding. So I think we'll have to think through how to articulate and communicate that nuance. But thanks for flagging that one.
Yep.
Robin,
I left a
anything?
note in there and we can
Okay.
look at it here.
Well, and Robin, anything to add for the benefit of the group on that one?
Not really, but I think taking to heart kind of Michelle's commentary on just this section in general can be a little bit clearer on what's being referred to. So just look at that from that context too.
Yep. Actually, can you stop screen share, Audrey? So a couple other things we'll be working on. So obviously, great discussion today. I know we're diving pretty deeply here and there. Thank you for your patience and the fantastic input. So we'll be taking all of that back, doing some editing. We also will continue what I think will hopefully be the kind of final follow-up on the bigger question marks with DAS around bond funding. That will, obviously, we've already gotten some input about things like the perpetual and running with the land piece, creating some space for additional instrument types. We also, I think, are getting some fairly positive feedback about the use of the funds, especially in the partnership context, and also for some of those due diligence considerations. So have some final outstanding questions to them. But by the time we all meet again, we'll have some updates. If there are changes, we'll flag those for you from the version you have now before the next meeting to reflect the updated information from DAS. One piece that we will want to protect a little bit of time to talk through at the beginning of the next meeting is in follow-up with DAS from their presentation and some of the kind of hypotheticals, I guess I would describe them as, that we talked through. We do have better clarity on kind of repayment and reimbursement timeframe in the form of a schematic and a complex spreadsheet. And I will just say that there is less flexibility on the look back than what those hypotheticals would have communicated. I'm saying that to this group because I think we will continue to want to be mindful of the importance of the general fund piece of this program's funding, because there will be some things that are beyond the look back period that will need to utilize that funding. I think we will, once we launch this program and folks understand what the guideposts are, we'll hopefully be in a situation where after 1 or 2 years of catch up, and all contingent on additional funding, we won't be in a situation where look back is challenging with the bond funding. But currently what we've learned is for the declaration of intent that they talked about that provided a longer look back period, in over 10 years of bond funding, that has been used only for direct pass-through grants. So an agency is granting because of legislative direction to a specific entity. That is not this program. This is a competitive grant program. So it was an important additional piece of information, and it just underscores for us this mix of general fund and bond fund, given that there may be a backlog of projects coming to this program, is going to be really important. So I'll stop there, see if folks have questions about that, and we can share with you the spreadsheet that we got that helps to show different scenarios if there's interest in that. I would say this has been a learning process for OWEB on bond funding, and I think we've been a little bit surprised that some of these answers weren't figured out before the program came to us relative to what different fund sources can and cannot do. So it's been a good and important learning process. So any questions on that or requests for follow-up? Okay. And our next meeting is scheduled on the 15th of March. Eric Hartstein, how do you want to give the RAC a glimpse into how we'll differentiate what we've edited versus kind of new information coming in from DAS? How have you guys managed that in other RAC processes?
Well, we haven't typically had other information coming in from other agencies at the same time, but what we can do is we can do track changes with revisions made to the sections that we walk through today. And we could think about if we need a different color or something with that input on that, and then so we'll be able to walk through these sections that we went through today and then get to the sections that we weren't able to, and get as far as we can at the next RAC meeting.
Michelle, go ahead.
Sorry. If we had additional comments on the sections we covered today, is it helpful to provide those by email before our next RAC session so you can integrate those, or what timing I guess is helpful if we had more comments?
Eric, can you speak to both timing, I think, and appropriate public process? So
yeah. No, I think it's absolutely fine to send in comments. In fact, it's probably really helpful. Audrey did a great job in capturing notes here, but if you have anything you wanted to highlight, anything additional, this is a lot of technical information, feel free to send them in to the OWEB staff. Also, if there's questions you want to go through on a one-on-one with OWEB staff, that's fine as well.
And I did fail to mention at the beginning that John Wickersham, I think this is the last meeting that he won't be able to join us. Robin had done outreach to make sure that we had some early input from John, knowing he was going to miss a couple meetings, and we'll catch him up before he joins us for the next RAC meeting. All right, any other feedback from RAC members? Any final questions from folks? All right, thank you for this marathon today. We appreciate your willingness to take a deep dive with us. We really appreciate the examples that all of you shared. Just so critical to build this program in a way that reflects the realities that you're facing on the ground. So we'll be in touch much earlier than we were this last time with draft rules for you to review, since we're working with a known quantity at this point. We'll have a few updates, of course, from DAS, and then it'll reflect your revisions via track changes. So thanks, everyone. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.